Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth. This program features in-depth conversations with the leading names in the subjects of UFOs, abductees, the paranormal, panel discussions, and the very best and brightest of the next generation of writers and researchers. Meanwhile Here on Earth, the show breaking new ground in alternative talk with your intrepid host, veteran investigative writer and researcher, Peter Robbins.
As the man said, this is Meanwhile Here on Earth, and I am Peter Robbins, and you are watching or listening on KGRA Digital Broadcasting. We are going to go right to the show, and I want to begin with a brief introduction of tonight's guest. Darcy Weir is a documentary filmmaker who has chosen to make films about some of the most fascinating subjects that are being discussed today. He has completed over 10 feature-length documentaries and recently completed a new documentary based on the history of UFO secrets in correlation with NASA's space research. He speaks to industry professionals who are working in difficult areas of space research and historically provable UFO events that coincide with our endeavors in outer space. He lays out facts with each chapter, designed to give educational information in an engaging and easy-to-understand way. He aims to demystify the secret space world for the masses. Additionally, he has completed a documentary called The Bitcoin Field Guide, which aims to educate folks on the nebulous space of crypto. And Darcy Weir, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth.
Tony, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Since we first connected, I think I've watched 7 of your documentaries from beginning to end. Normally, I try to prepare if I have an author on, if they have multiple books to read at least one of them. And I just got hooked in part because you do what you do very well. And it's content that almost all of it is interesting to me already, but you're very methodical in the way that you go about addressing your subjects, and we'll get into that more later. I'm a film lover, and I have been since I can first remember. All kinds of films, and it was my minor when I was studying for my BFA at the School of Visual Arts in New York, and I think if I hadn't gone into this field of work or the arts, I could have easily ended up as a film historian or the like. And one of my first questions for you is, most people that go into filmmaking in part are captured by the romance of Hollywood, lifestyles, the mythology, and working in a generally perceived as exciting industry. You decided to become a documentary filmmaker. And some of my film heroes are documentary filmmakers, and I grew up with them as well as regular feature films. Can we go back kind of to the beginning? Where were you born, for starters?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Canadian. I was born in Toronto, Ontario, and I myself, am a lover of the medium of film. I went to film school and got a degree, technical diploma in film and video production, and I also went to university and studied film as a theoretical study. And when I was pursuing my theoretical film, Bachelor of Arts, I ended up taking sociology as my other major, and I got very exposed to the documentary film, genre. And you've got Noam Chomsky, you've got all these famous, sociologists, and there's many documentaries that they've made to explain their theories. And I realized early on that this is a really cool, film genre to work in because it's life. It's sometimes stranger than fiction.
Yeah.
And when I embarked on making my first documentary back in 2009, um, about underground bases, and I
Yeah.
got to interview Richard Dolan and Richard Sauter
Oh,
and
yeah.
talk to Phil Schneider's family.
Yeah.
Uh, it's a pretty infamous story, and
I'll say.
I I definitely I knew after making that documentary I wanted to follow up and do many more documentaries in ufology,
Yeah.
and because it's just such a multi-layered, uh, you know, multifaceted
Yeah.
study field, and there's so many different stories that come out of these different layers.
It sure is. And you certainly chose to start off your film career with one of the most aggressively sensational series of claims and credible witnesses that you could have possibly found. Um, when you were growing up, was film much of a part of your life and family life, either on television or going out to a movie theater?
Well, I mean, my parents were lovers of film, and
Ah.
as a family we were engaged in every type of science fiction film or television you could see. My
Yeah.
dad, likes he always liked the X-Files, and he liked
Mhm.
Stargate and all these types of films that I guess the interesting thing is that a lot of the true parts of this ufology or the paranormal are mirrored in fiction.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
I
It's
think,
so true.
when I became an adult and I started researching all this stuff very uh, profusely, I realized that, oh my God, like so many fiction films out there, the writers that are putting together these pieces of art have actually been exposed to these stories or the lore that has a lot of truth in it in the
Yes.
background of life. So,
Yeah.
uh, you know, I did two Bigfoot documentaries, and I remember watching Harry and the Hendersons and I was a really young kid, and I was like, what the heck is this like monkey man doing in the forest interacting with this family, right? And you know, here I am at the age of 37, and
Chasing monkey men.
I'm chasing the researchers of Monkey Men,
Ah, yes.
and
Yeah.
so I'm sitting down with Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum at his Idaho State University laboratory and looking at, one of over 300 footcasts he's collected
Mm.
from across North America and the world regarding these cryptid sightings, right? And you're
Yeah.
like, hey, Harry and the Hendersons, that had truth to it,
Yeah.
apparently.
Yeah. It's like some people come into the serious world of UFO studies because of an affection for science fiction. Although I don't know if you've encountered this, I have found it's a generalization, but overall, people who are deeply involved in science fiction as a primary passion or interest in life, if you were to be having conversation with them and to say that you took the subject of actual UFO non-terrestrial visitation seriously, some of them would laugh in your face. It's all fine if it's fictional, but they're as deeply historically as conditioned or more conditioned than the general population to not taking it seriously. Their world is unlimited in its potential, where uh, serious ufological research has its limits for sure as you continue to explore it. Um, was there a documentary that you saw growing up as opposed to a feature film that really stuck with you to some degree and maybe was one of the impetus? For me, there were quite a number, but if I was aiming toward being a filmmaker, like watching just a great golden age Hollywood feature film and dreaming about being a director or an actor or producer, was there a documentary film or documentary filmmaker that particularly inspired you?
Yeah, I think two to note that just come off the top of my head, in terms of ufology, or this whole kind of paranormal aspect of research.
Mm-hmm.
The first one that comes to mind is Jose Escamilla's the greatest. I think it's called like UFOs, the greatest truth ever untold, or something. This is before
Mm,
he started doing stuff about rods,
yeah,
and stuff like that.
yeah.
But I'd seen it uh, probably in 1998 or something like that.
Mm,
My older brother gave it to me, and I was like, "What is this?" And it was showing, UFO videos and
yeah,
testimony from some of the folks that had to do with the Disclosure Project, and uh, yeah, key witnesses and stuff to Area 51 and all that type of stuff. It really blew my mind. And then I think a little bit later on was probably Beyond the Blue by James Fox,
yeah,
who I think is a master of his
yes.
craft at this point.
He sure is.
And I'm still trying to learn and be as good as the big cats on the
Yeah,
filmmaking scene. But
yeah.
yeah, he definitely influenced his research and documentation of this subject, influenced me as a documentarian.
Um, your methodology in research, and those of us that are self-trained, um, we go about it in different ways, but it's about drilling down multiple sources, cross-referencing sources, doing your very best, even if you're leaning into an explanation or theory, to continue to keep a consistent objectivity and let everything play out in your mind before beginning to refine it. Um, I was really impressed with it. Kind of defines the structure of some of your films, including um, Crop Circle Realities and Being Taken. These are documentaries um, that Darcy has done on the UFO abduction phenomena and the crop formation or so-called crop circle phenomena. I found at times, and I say this with respect and as a compliment, I wasn't sure where you were going because you took a good amount of time, which is a good thing to do, to lay out a theory or an allegation or a popular idea that somebody has put forward, and then do your best to prove it, disprove it, chase it down, but most important, present it to your viewer as objectively as you can, and then go on to the next one. Um, this is not, this is grown up documentary stuff. This is not sensationalistic, you know, I had an alien baby with my uncle from another planet. Um, it's really grounded. And when I looked at the clock, I've worked in the abduction field for many years, and so that really kind of hit home. I thought you treated the subject, when all was said and done, with real respect, and left open the window that somebody like me, who no longer has the luxury of disbelief, will allow people to kind of go through that opening and say, good Lord, there does seem to be something to this particular set of allegations. And again, same for crop circles. That particularly hit home because you featured a friend and a colleague of mine and somebody I was lucky enough to meet in Wiltshire, in crop circle country some years back. And one is Gary King, who is a crop circle authority who lives in Wiltshire and who narrates part of your documentary there, and very well. He's amazingly knowledgeable and articulate. And Michael Glickman, the late, great Michael Glickman, one of the greatest crop circle scholars of all time, and had dinner with him in Wiltshire and a number of conversations. What was it that, did you feel pulled along subject by subject, or were you doing this in a methodical kind of planned out way, or like a creative person with a divining rod? You finish a documentary and kind of see where it's going to go next. How would you talk about that part of your creative process?
Sure. So when I was making Being Taken, I did it with my friend Lee Lustig, and you know, we knew that there was a story to the abduction phenomenon, and at that point, there's a ton of abduction films that are out now,
Sure.
but at the point that we shot the interviews in 2018 with Stanton Friedman, Kathleen Marden,
Yeah.
Travis Walton. There was the Travis documentary that was produced by Catherine previously. I think it was literally the year previous to when we did this interviews.
Well, there was the the true story of Travis Walton
Yeah,
by Jennifer Stein, which
Jennifer Stein. Sorry.
yeah,
Yeah,
I was associate producer on that, and I'm very proud of my part in that phenomenal documentary.
it's a great documentary. We even use excerpts from that with the permission from Jennifer.
That's great.
So, yeah, so that, you know, if you look at that documentary, it is a documentary about Travis, everything to do with the fire in the sky story. What we wanted to do is kind of like lay down the foundation of the abduction phenomenon,
You
talk
sure
about
did that well.
talk about, how this predates Travis's encounter.
Yeah.
We go into paleo abductions and we go into the debunkers. I really wanted to profile debunkers
Yes.
because they're a thing, and debunkery, or proving something is a hoax, is important to ufology and any research field. Even science, you need to
Sure.
prove when a
Absolutely.
theory is completely wrong. But it became apparent when we were making this documentary that there had been an active suppression through debunkery by using Philip J. Klass, who
That's
was
correct.
linked to the CIA
Yep.
and the military. So
Exactly.
Why I wanted to make that documentary is to just kind of cover, we call it the definitive documentary on abduction. Of course, we missed mentioning Bud Hopkins, who was amazing in his books, and that came out in 1980, I believe, the Missing Time book.
81.
81. Okay,
Yeah.
so he was writing it in 80, and it just really profiled all the aspects we know about abduction today.
Very historic book.
We missed David Jacobs,
Yeah.
but we wanted to cover the very important themes about abduction.
Yeah.
And I think what happened whenever I was making that documentary, which I'm also, always when I'm making these documentaries, you're in the middle of making the documentary and you go, okay, I want to make this. I want to make another documentary on this story, on this aspect. And you make a note, and then you finish what you're working on and you go, all right, now I'm going to start working on you. And Crop Circle Realities, I think that came about because I was actually working with the Mexican journalist Jaime Maussan.
Yeah.
He's an infamous character.
Yep.
A lot of people, go black and white on him. They either say, he's a fraud or he's a saint. And there's gray area. And I produced like a biography on him, just how he got into reporting UFOs. That was called Maussan's UFO Files. And in making that, I had come across all this archival footage from his studio in Mexico City. I traveled down to interview him there. And he, showed me all these other aspects that he had researched if you go back and you look at the original National Press Club disclosure project, briefing
Year 2000.
in 2000, you could see Jaime Maussan walking up and down the aisle. So he's like so integral to ufology in Mexico,
Correct.
and I think he's an interesting character, and that's why I wanted to make a few documentaries with
Yeah.
him. One
Yeah.
of the things he reported on really well was the crop circle phenomenon, and uh, he flew over to the UK to Wiltshire, and had met Gary King, and Gary King, as you know, has walked in over 900 different crop
That's
circles
right.
throughout his time as a researcher on boots on the ground,
Yep.
and he was conducting tours and stuff whenever they would show up. And so he got introduced to Jaime, and he became kind of like Jaime has his own news show. He started off as a 60 Minutes reporter, and he covered UFOs with Billy Meyer and some of the early cases. And then it just evolved from there, and he became the UFO reporter in Mexico. And he created his own show, Tercer Milenio, which airs every week, every day in Mexico, and has over 20 million,
Yeah.
live watchers every time it's on TV. And yeah, basically Gary King started being like a overseas crop circle correspondent for Jaime's show. And so I ended up covering the reality of the situation of crop circles, because once I got to know Gary King's story and all of the really interesting facts surrounding crop circles, I thought there's something here, and I started researching deeper into it. The Doug Bauer, Dave Chorley claims that they made all crop circles previous to the famous circle, the incredible design showing up in the 1990s. It just became more and more apparent that was impossible.
Yeah, and I'm glad you gave it the full treatment, because I remember when they really commanded the news in Great Britain when a new one would appear. And it was, for a while, the media's incredibly irresponsible exit to say, well, nothing to see here, folks, let's move along. When, of course, we are, and the question, to paraphrase Stanton Friedman, is not all crop circles the product of some extraordinary, unexplainable technology or intelligence? Has one ever been? And certainly there are ones, and you and I know it's not a bunch of flattened boards. You have several million stalks of rye, wheat, or grain that develop an elbow and grow sideways in a second, and in some cases are laid down on a circle that is counterspun. In other cases, a circle that the crop is plated. It's braided together, and these things are, of course,
Yeah, woven.
impossible.
Yeah,
Except
yeah,
they're real.
especially in the manner that they show up in terms
Yeah.
of timing.
Yeah.
Sometimes, you know, people that fly ultralight planes have gone over these crop areas in Wiltshire during the day,
And then come
and
back the other way.
when they come back the other way 45 minutes later,
That's
they
right.
see a massive formation. And if we compare some of these massive formations, you look at NVIDIA, the graphics chip maker. They did a famous GPU chip in the middle of a crop,
Mm-hmm.
and that project took them $20 million and four weeks to complete, with hundreds of people. They were using geolocation, tagging poles that were connected to satellites, all kinds of stuff. And that was on flat terrain. In the documentary that I produced with the help of Gary and Jaime and, all these other folks, you look at these formations that, like you said, are almost like they're woven.
Yes.
They showed up in like incredibly short amounts of time that we know if us humans were involved, it would have taken days, weeks, maybe a month to complete that complex.
Yeah.
And most of them show up on hills.
That's
So you're
right.
not working with a completely flat terrain, like, and you're also not working with the same medium every time. Sometimes they've shown up in canola, which is like
That's right.
as thick as celery
Yeah.
and has flowers on top, right? So to create that delicately, not damage the flowers, not completely break the stalk in half, while this is being laid out on a hill,
Yeah.
and it looks perfectly symmetrical from the sky.
Yeah.
It's like we don't have human crews that can do that.
No.
But people in ufology, people in the mainstream media have completely written this off to be all man-made. And I thought the interesting story here is it's impossible that they are all man-made.
It is, and it was really quite a job to essentially give everybody license to be their worst selves journalistically, and say, "Oh well, one of them is faked. I don't want my paper to be made fun of by reporting on one that then turns out to have been faked." Brings us to another subject, though, which is I've visited the United Kingdom 20 or 25 times in my life, and spent part of one summer in Wiltshire in the crop circle country. And one of the things that fascinated me was the, how can I say, the circles themselves or the formations themselves. Some of them give off particular magnetic resonance sequences, sound not available to the human ear, which the BBC and the British military have confirmed. It's, again, the ability to condition people to think if they take something seriously publicly that is controversial, they will suffer. They will be made fun of. They will be pointed out. They will be thought of as, an extremist, a kook, a mystic, what have you. But as we know, of course, there are people, and more, every summer, who maybe even take their summer vacation, camp on the area with the farmer's permission or paying for their space, and they create them. And I've met a number of these people. There are a group that come out of the modern art tradition that really was in full flower 50 odd years ago, of conceptual and minimal art. Not that they've gone away, but that was really the time they emerged out of. And a group of artists led by almost a megalithic sculptor named Michael Smithson decided to do earthworks, where you lease a remote piece of property, create some extraordinary structure on it with natural materials, photograph it from a helicopter, use it to get a national arts grant, or be subsidized by collectors. That's one group of people that make them. There's another group, and I think they were the first, who liked having it off on the public or the media and doing something that was reported as authentic, and then they could have bragging rights to say, "No, I fooled you." Most interesting, though, and these people are very sincere, they come together in the summers and they work as teams, and they create, and some of them are absolutely exquisite and perfectly, symmetrical, around, or what have you, with minimum prints leading in and out. But they do it as an obsession, and they don't know why. And they keep coming back and doing it again, in cases at the risk of a fine for trespassing on private property, or destroying material.
Crops.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which is very real.
It kind of comes back to fiction being mirrored in reality with the devil's what's that in Close Encounters of the Third Kind? All the experiencers keep seeing this vision, and the main character is building with mud. The devil's you know what I'm talking about. It looks like a big stump in
Devil's
the middle.
Tower.
Devil's Tower,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
like that is very common in the experiencer or abductee phenomenon, that they keep coming back to these visions, they keep coming back to this experience that they have, this sort of message that they're receiving, and sometimes pursue it at their own detriment.
Now, you tackle one subject in several documentaries, among the most challenging, um, polarizing in the history and world of UFO studies, uh, fascinating, and in terms of its implications and where it fits into the world of black projects and possible places where non-human intelligence dovetails with human intelligence, is this genre that's become known as the secret space program. I think anybody my age who grew up with the original Mercury astronauts as, kind of folk heroes, understood even as a kid that NASA was a publicly owned government operation. It was for the people, explore space, all this idealistic stuff. But would every mission be made public? Would every mission be declared? Weren't there some, appropriately, especially in that golden age of beginning to put up satellites, of that it's really none of our business for national security reasons? I get it. But of course, at the extremes of claims of the secret space program, it's a lot to wrap your head around, if that's even possible. How were you introduced to the idea of the secret space program, and how did your progress in researching it progress? And were there moments where you had to kind of go through a very large doorway and say, good Lord, this is also possible?
Yeah, so I actually was introduced to the secret space phenomenon and the idea that NASA was fronting as just a purely public organization, but really was concealing a lot of the information and research that they were conducting
Mm-hmm.
to the public. Back when I first saw, this is another documentary, I guess, that it's a very crude documentary, but still influenced me. But it was made by a Canadian guy from Western Canada, Martin Stubbs, The
Oh my
Smoking
gosh.
Gun. Yeah, The
I
Smoking
I knew
Gun.
Martin back in the day. I'm talking early 90s.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. So yeah, the documentary is called, I think, NASA Files, the NASA tapes.
It was originally
Um,
on VHS.
Yeah, and it's called like The Smoking Gun. And what he
Yes,
did
that's right.
was, the really interesting thing about him is that he was working in an industry of television, but on the back end in sort of like the IT, not the IT, but
Correct.
the
And
production
he kept
role.
that channel open, running, and recording.
Yes, yeah. He actually managed Shaw Cable's station, which is a pretty famous West Coast Canadian cable network that
Mm.
was supplying during the 80s and 90s and early 2000s tons of typical TV channels to Canadians to watch and absorb content, news, whatever. And he would run their news station satellites to intercept NASA's downlink of their video and
Yeah.
communication feeds. Pretty smart guy, and he directed his sort of like online Betacam receiver guys that did nightly work to run the tapes overnight and record that downlink signal, and then he would collect the tapes and review
Yeah.
them later on.
And boy,
And
some of the stuff that he found was jaw-dropping.
he found some really, interesting, very thought-provoking UFO videos that are occurring in space above the Earth's atmosphere.
That's right.
So one of the most famous cases is STS-80, where you're looking at like the continent of Africa. There's a big lightning storm, a big tropical storm happening over the continent, and we could see these flashes of light are definitely like electrical storms that are happening.
Yeah.
And as that's happening, we see these objects slowly come into the picture. One of them actually flies right by the camera. And this is an STS mission. It's a shuttle mission. It just glides past, and then as it comes into the center of a circular formation of these objects, it actually illuminates. And NASA's front and their cover story for any one of these videos back in the STS missions is always going to be, this is ice or this is space debris. And I've watched Jim Oberg go nuts on YouTube comments. He's one of NASA's former spokesman, and he really does not have an argument for that video at all, because ice and space debris cannot stay in formation, in a perfect formation around a lightning storm above Earth. So, hey, some people might say they're not UFOs; they might be just smart satellites. But I don't think that's even possible to get that close to the Earth's atmosphere without coming through. So, it was that earlier work by Martin Stubbs that intrigued me, and I realized through looking at very credible video like that there was something there. And then with this documentary that you watched, probably Secret Space UFOs in the beginning,
Yes.
I tracked down a secret space researcher that I found very credible, that had poured through NASA declassified documents, poured through NASA transcripts of astronauts talking, looked at all the photos from the many different space missions, whether that's Gemini, Mercury, Apollo 1 to 17, plus you've got the lunar orbiter while the early Apollo missions are going on. And this guy even spoke to a Belcom engineer that worked for the Apollo program. This is like a really early case of a third-party contractor that's basically working for the military.
Got it.
And this guy confirmed to Carrie Martinuk, is this researcher I'm speaking of. He goes by the name of Luna Cognita. That it's very accurate to say that NASA is a research organization that is very closely linked to military and third-party contractors, and they literally follow classification rules, safeguarding the public, just like any other military organization. So if you think about it that way, NASA is not what they say they are. And when you hear about them making these statements recently that they are interested in UFOs, you have to realize that they've always been interested in UFOs, and it's part of their mandate to cover that up.
Yeah.
Because it falls into a classification basket with early rules like the executive order that Eisenhower signed into power back in 1952, which is, it escapes me, I think it's 10501. And that was basically the very early document that allowed every military or agency, intelligence agency, as well as scientific and academic institutions to follow when they made a discovery that was threatening to socio or economic controls within the United States. And, we know that the United States, their stances on protecting the economy is basically reflected to all other Western world partners. So the UK, France, Germany, Australia, Canada, all of them kind of have to follow suit because the Americans are the guys with the biggest
That's right.
stick,
Yeah.
and their economy usually reverberates and affects all other economies. So, in a later documentary, I'm going to try and prove that, uh, safeguarding this information is, um, it's, people complain all the time. Why is that UFOs are only seen in the United States? Well, you'll probably see from my documentary that documentaries that I've produced, that's a complete fallacy. They're seen all over the world.
Of course.
And I think the agreement internationally is to cooperate with the American government and make sure that it's always played down and it's always swept under the rug. There's nothing to see here, whether that's in
That is the
space
way.
or here on the ground.
Yeah, that is the way it is. Went for the first 70 years, literally, without much of a hiccup, from 1947 on. And we have, as we know, been seeing more change, the less and less grip of UFO ridicule as something that can potentially ruin my life and my career. I want to come back to the space aspects of the secret space program in the second half of the show and talk a bit about something that's both intrigued me, and when I first became more and more involved in the work, that when I didn't even hear the phrase, it was like I wanted to cover my face. It sounded so hokey and so science fiction-y and so dreamy and almost childlike, of secret underground bases. Well, that's real Flash Gordon, and except that, as we know, not only is that not the case, but for well over half a century, almost every country in the world has created secret underground areas for any number of things. Industry does it now, pharmaceuticals, tests, etc. But the concept of secret underground bases is very real and something that I think that they have been doing, that we have been doing, that in cases they may intersect. And then there's the whole world of natural caverns and caves, I'm sure many of which we have no fathomable idea of, miles below the earth, where who knows what's been going on for how long. Dr. David Sauter is certainly one of the acknowledged authorities on this subject. I don't know David, but we met several times and I've read his books also.
Richard Sauter. Yeah.
You bet. Exactly. Richard Sauter. And by extension, undersea or underwater bases, which also at first just sounded so untenable or fictional, except again that they're very real. So let's talk a bit about your first documentary, and forgive me, but what you dug down to find.
Well, yeah, it's a controversial documentary, and as it was the very first piece that I had ever created, I think I rushed the journalistic sort of research integrity, and I believed a lot of the things that Phil Schneider had claimed about himself and his life and such right off the bat.
For our viewers and listeners who are not familiar with the late Phil Schneider and his story, why don't you take some time and give a capsule history of what we're talking about here as the subject and this individual who centers the story.
Sure. So Phil Schneider made a very extravagant claim that he was working on a secret facility, building a military industrial complex base.
And this would have been about when?
During the 1970s, late 1970s, early 80s.
Continue on.
And he claimed that this was out underneath the Archuleta Mesa in Dulce, New Mexico. when they were boring down and trying to hollow out this area of the mesa where they were going to create a facility, equipment started coming up broken. And so they thought, let's send down one of our geologists. We'll send down Phil Schneider. He got in a basket. And this is where the sort of story takes this James Bond slash Rambo turn of events. And
From Star Trek too.
And he becomes face to face with a gray set of gray aliens that are tall, and he takes out his Walther PPK with a 9-shot modified clip and shoots them. And they are mortal. They do die, as he says. And, they shoot back with some kind of laser beam and fried his fingers off. And, when he did this lecture tour back in the early 90s, he would always show his hand. His hand was heavily deformed. So he had a very heroic sort of story he weaved into this underground base building story. And when I created the documentary, I took his claims and I juxtaposed them with a lot of the sort of realities in terms of how far are we in terms of technology that could build underground bases, so on and so forth. When I released the documentary, I wanted to also compare stuff that came out of the famous History Channel show Ancient Aliens, and they had discussed sites like Darren Kuyu, which, as people might note, is thousands of years old and goes many, many layers underneath the ground. And it was hewn out of solid stone to perfection, did not collapse in on itself anywhere. And it housed up to 20,000 people. So I wanted to also include that. I didn't include it in the final version, but then years later, I saw the History Channel actually covering subterranes, which are nuclear powered tunnel boring machines that we do know we have patents for in the patent office in the United States. You're muted, Peter. Sorry, you're muted.
Sorry. I was just going to say that they have used those borers or variations of them modified for civilian use to create part of the expanding subway system under New York City, among other locations.
Yeah. So, I mean, this was all old patents and all of this stuff. Although we might be quite confident that there's lots of underground structures today in 2022, it was pretty mind expanding in 2009 when I first embarked on making this documentary. And, the sensationalism that comes out of underground bases will never go away. Phil Schneider's story is very interesting. Not all of it is true, but the actual premise of underground bases being built and actively used to facilitate exotic technological scientific experiments, which may include housing things like UFOs, I think that's a very important truth and reality to the underground base subject. And that's why I made the documentary entitled The Underground.
I think it goes back in any substantial way to at least the 1950s, when we know an extraordinary complex was created under a part of Virginia, which ironically was enterable through a period hotel owned by the government, which would have housed a good portion of the United States government's leading officials and their families for a prolonged period of time if necessary. And when that was discovered and retired, a new one was created in the Beltway general area for the same purpose.
Yeah.
With good cause.
to
But
facilitate continuity of government in terms of catastrophic event, right?
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Um,
And
and
Rumbo
even
Manor
before
in the
that,
United Kingdom is another example.
yep, we know that there's military bases that the United States employs underground in Saudi Arabia, and the Maginot Line during World War II, and after World War II, we learned when we were before Project Paperclip, Project Alos, we sent over a special research team to go to the former Nazi areas. And when they went into the mountain, they found, underneath where they were had the V2 rockets being
That's right.
developed by Werner von Braun and his
Yeah,
people. This was all built under a mountain by
that's right.
um, actually slaves, by a lot of
Correct.
captured slaves were helping build the V2 rockets.
Yeah.
And it was, just if we go back that far, we go into ancient history with places like Kuyu. We've always had an interest in going underground to facilitate safety, security, and to keep things out of sight,
Mhm.
out of sound.
Correct.
And there's no reason that we're not still employing that same strategy when it comes to covert projects, black
Yep.
budget research,
Yeah.
and high technology that we don't want the public to see.
Well, I think if not more in contemporary times, I think that was a particularly visionary documentary for a first shot at the form, and again, it was it reinforced that feeling I have every once in a while, wherever I am in the world, whether it's in a rural or an urban area, of wondering what might be going down, what might be going on. Uh, Several hundred, several thousand feet below where I'm standing completely oblivious to the nature of their activities. Um, in your work, have you come upon a subject that surprised you with how intrigued you became, how interesting it got, that has not left you? You finish one documentary or you write a book and you move on to the next subject. Is there something that lingers with you, that stayed with you, a moment in your own research where you were caused to have a life reflecting experience?
Yeah, you know what? I actually, uh, it may seem kind of silly, but I worked with certain partners to make some of my documentaries. I've interviewed every kind of researcher. I've interviewed Stanton Friedman, who was a nuclear physicist before he passed.
Yeah.
I interviewed all kinds of really, high profile ufologists, abductees. But I worked with some folks that are involved in UFO media, sort of UFO news, so to speak, and they played really dirty. I learned when I worked with them, in terms of creating gossip about me, and really just getting personal and talking about my
What?
films and all this stuff. And
Yeah.
it was that was probably something that lingered, that really hurt. And
I'm
I
going
I
to
real
ask you to hold that thought because we
Sure.
have to go to break right now. This is Peter Robbins with my guest for this evening, filmmaker Darcy Weir, and we will be back shortly.
Hey members, the new KGRA DB app is now available on iOS and Android devices. Gain on-demand access to any KGRA DB programming. Download any show directly to your mobile device to listen or watch on the go. Go to the App Store and search KGRA DB.
Are we alone in the universe? The most important question facing humanity is on the verge of being settled once and for all. The Mutual UFO Network has been at the forefront of this journey for nearly 50 years. Our members worldwide are dedicated to the research, documentation, and awareness that will shape the future of humanity. Won't you join us?
Discover the Observation Deck, a one-of-a-kind virtual event platform that takes video conferencing to the next level by using avatars to navigate a campus. There's so many areas and activities to choose from. There's a 1,000-seat auditorium, an expo hall, a nightclub, and even a beach. So come attend a conference, take a class, or hear a lecture on the incredible Observation Deck campus. Go to theobservationdk.com.
You're listening to the KGRA Digital Broadcasting Network. We provide unparalleled coverage of trending news in the world of ufology, cryptozoology, and paranormal phenomenon. Whether you're watching our video live stream or listening to one of our audio programs, you are getting the best from world-renowned researchers and hosts, guiding you through topics the mainstream won't touch. Miss one of your favorite programs? No problem. Head over to the members area at kgradb.com for access to our massive library of award-winning content. Make contact, stay connected, only at kgradb.com.
And this is Meanwhile Here on Earth, continuing for our second half of the show. Peter Robbins, your host, Darcy Weir, documentary filmmaker, my guest today. Darcy, where you left off, it can be disheartening when you do work. You do your best to keep ethical, balanced, present the best information you can as your conclusions, and people come at you and badmouth you. I think part of that comes under the caveat, if you can't attack the message, attack the messenger. And you do a very good job in your documentary films to make your points well enough that a hardcore skeptic needs to really pull back and examine whether or not there is information here worthy of changing their mind, rather than just another thing to dismiss. But it hurts. It hurts sometimes when it happens.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I was getting at. It just I'd made so many films with, interviewing so many different types of people, 8 feature films or 9 feature films at this point. And then I made one feature film with, one certain group of influencers in the UFO community. And then I was threatened by them and bullied and harassed personally by one of their sort of henchmen. And it's just crazy to see that kind of behavior when literally you're trying to research something to get to the bottom of this for the greater good.
Yeah.
And you find out quite quickly that the main motivation for some of these other folks that are in this this research field is really for entertainment and
Yes.
for them to gain popularity and money. That is the main motivation for these folks, is what I found. And when you start to question that motivation with them, or as a friend to most people, I will always hold a mirror up to them and reflect back to them, like, you might want to be careful about making this decision because that's going to affect you in the long run. And I think I was doing this at one point, and I realized I couldn't work with those people anymore because they're so set in their way of doing things that revolves around this different paradigm that I'm used to, which is really just create for attention, create for money, and create for power, really. And you see that happening in ufology all the time today, right? And there's this power struggle going on between different influencers, and it's sad. It's really pathetic and weird, and it really. I tried to illustrate when this was all going down, that it hurts the subject because you actually have so much mud being slung from both
Yes.
sides that
Yes.
if somebody's interested in this subject for the first time in their life,
They're going to
because
be put off.
yeah, then they're just coming into it. They're going to see the slinging. They're not going to see the story that's at the center of it that should be uniting everybody, that
Yes.
should be intriguing everybody to find the next answer to the questions that are evolving from this answer, right? But instead they're getting hit by some mud that's, being thrown between all these different warring parties. And that was probably the thing that stuck with me the most recently as a filmmaker, because it's very real. I've never been harassed by MIB or CIA agents. I don't think I have anything that would be alarming to them enough for that type of thing to happen. I'm speculating intelligently via good research on what is out there in the public domain, but what usually lingers are the things that touch you personally, and by getting involved with some people, that's where things got kind of dangerous for me. And I think people have to realize that sometimes it might not be suits or law agencies that are the most dangerous. It's actually the influencers out there that have a so-called army, of social influence they can sick on you.
Darcy, again, turning our attention back to the so-called secret space program, it's one thing to accept a very understandable reality of a history of classified missions, as well as publicly acknowledged, known, and broadcast missions of all sorts on NASA's part from its inception on. But to make a jump to secret black budget advanced technology projects in the domain, so to say, of the secret space program involve, among other things, fleets of advanced spaceships that are interfacing with, and in some cases in conflict with, bad aliens, for lack of a better term, or that training of individuals selected out in special forces kind of situations. That training occurs at one of our bases on Mars, and after service they can be transported back in time, so they re-enter their life at that moment when they moved off to highly secret service on behalf of whatever. Did you start to encounter these claims? Did you investigate them to the best degree that you could? And how do you feel about claims like this? I'm sure you're familiar with them.
Yeah, so I'm familiar with the claims. I think these claims have been actually more popular than the basic secret space
Yeah.
theories that are out there. That we've encountered things on the Gemini missions, on the
There you go.
Mercury missions,
Yeah.
on the Apollo missions. Like, that is enough for most people to scratch their head and say,
You bet.
okay, and then what did we find on the moon? But
Yes.
then when somebody makes a claim of being age regressed to their former body after completing, many missions in space for the United States military on secret black budget military missions, this is where, you get kind of into that Phil Schneider area of claiming something spectacular. And I'm actually very interested in these individuals, and I would love to actually meet with some of them and interview them and get their perspective clearly and completely, read out to me so that I can build a more understandable side to that story.
Mm-hmm.
I think, where I do stand is that I need to have proof of certain things before I can jump to the conclusion that everything, had been said by somebody is correct.
Yes.
There's so much proof just in the declassified documents that have come out of NASA that there truly have been some anomalous or UFO type events that have happened in space during our early space projects. Right now, that stuff doesn't really get declassified anymore. We
Yeah.
don't have this treasure trove of declassified documents like we had 12 years after the Gemini project finished, or 12 years after the Apollo space missions finished.
Mm,
Those became declassified, those voice transcripts and
that's right.
that type of stuff that the astronauts saw on the dark side of the moon when they were beyond the communication that Houston or Capcom was able to facilitate with the capsule, with the CSM. And I think those are really important events in history to prove that there's something to the UFO phenomenon in space.
Yes.
When you get to things being very, very provocative to the point that people are saying they're having space battles with UFOs of, ET races that are malevolent to Earth. I think that's somewhere I do actually want to explore with my documenting of this secret space subject. So, if there's people out there listening that know more about that, please do reach out. Email is media@occultjourneys.com. But I'm always going to remain a bit skeptical about those claims until I get proof.
Darcy, you touched on it when we kind of started at the top. The phenomena of these mysterious hominids, these Sasquatch, Yeti, abominable snowman, different names, different cultures, so many reports from around the world going back into more simple days. And like the Loch Ness Monster to a degree, or like other embodied mysteries, you have people not unlike myself who are dedicating a good part of their lives to investigating this area. As you mentioned, your documentary on Sasquatch is at least as much about the people doing the work. And let's talk a little about them. Was there something you could generalize about them, or was it like somebody from, any walk of life who has a profound UFO sighting or experience who then becomes involved? Can you characterize some of these people that you work with making that documentary?
Yeah, so I ended up making two documentaries. The first one was called The Unwanted Sasquatch, and that featured Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum from Idaho State University, Bill Miller, who is a researcher from Idaho that lived in British Columbia before he passed away. Grover Kranz, who was kind of like the first anatomist and anthropologist in a university setting that took a very serious look at the Bigfoot or Sasquatch sighting phenomenon. And of course, Thomas Steenberg, who's another fellow Canadian. He was from Alberta. Canada, and John Green, who's a Canadian that passed away not too long ago and was one of the very first investigators on the scene when the first Bigfoot tracks were found in the 1950s. He was that old. He was a young man running a newspaper in British Columbia at the time that they had heard reports of a upright, hairy, sort of gorilla type being harassing a construction crew in Northern California while they were building the tracks, the train tracks. And he flew out, investigated the prints on site, saw, interviewed some of the people, the men that were working that had quit out of fear because they had seen these what seemed to be relic hominids walking around in the forest. And that documentary really came to me because I went to a festival in northern British Columbia called Sasquatch Days, which is celebrated by the native Canadians, a tribe called the Stehalis. And they have a totem pole that they have a Sasquatch-looking being, a gorilla-looking creature in, and they have a famous Sasquatch costume that they wear. And J.W. Burns, who's the original man, he was an English teacher that lived on the native reserve in the 1920s. He actually lived amongst the Stehalis, and they told him the story of the Sasquatch. And he actually coined the word Sasquatch because he couldn't quite pronounce Sasquatch, didn't really understand the word. So that's where that actually comes from, as a Canadian man that lived among the natives. And he transcribed their stories, and that's how the word Sasquatch became a word. The word Bigfoot became known in the 1950s because that famous Northern California Gazette came out, and they published Bigfoot, and then in parentheses beside that, feet found all around this track construction site. People are scared, quitting, whatever, and it's haunted the subject to today. And I think whenever you hear about Bigfoot, you think, oh, it's a singular creature, and that really screws over the research and the credibility of it. But the general thesis is that these creatures live in a scarce population and have been seen in deep wilderness when we've come across them or they've come across us in their pilgrimage. And perhaps they're still alive today, but the unwanted Sasquatch was supposed to be called The Last Sasquatch, but a horror film had kind of stole that name for me. Unwanted means scarce or hard to find, and it's kind of an old English word. People always try to correct me and say, oh, don't you mean unwanted? Can't you spell? But I think outside of the box in terms of naming this type of stuff, I guess. That documentary came to me because I went to the Native Canadian Festival, and I sat down with Bill Miller and Thomas Steenberg there, and they went over the Patterson-Gimlin tape. They introduced me to that family. I got the rights to use their footage in the doc, and it just kind of all grew from there. And I wanted to make a very credible sort of analytical thesis to why that footage is very real. It's not a guy in a suit. It's most likely a female creature of some kind. And then the second documentary that I made, called Sasquatch Among Wild Men, really expands on that thesis from, that famous encounter of a creature that looks like an upright hominid, or an ape-like creature, which we are hominids. We're just a lot less hairy from head to toe, some of us more than others. But, you look at our history walking here on this planet, supposedly, the known scientific mainstream history is that we started showing up, Homo sapiens, around 250,000 to 325,000 years, give or take, right? And at the same time, we've found fossils of these upright hominid, ape-like, man-ish type creatures, but more built like a gorilla sometimes, or more built like almost like a taller chimpanzee at certain times, um, 200,000 years ago, or only 80,000 years ago, or in the case of, the possibly orang pendek, could be this Homo florensis creature that we know is like almost like a hobbit, they've called it. They found in Indonesia, and we found remains of that are only 25,000 or 19 or 18,000. Every time we carbon date these, they come closer to, in when they were physically for sure walking around with us, because we were here 300,000 years ago. So then you got this thing that looked like a monster looked like Harry from Harry and the Hendersons. If, we were to describe it and walk across it now, it actually was walking around at the same time we were on this planet. And it's very credible that we were probably fighting them. And, there's stories, Native Canadian or Native American stories of cave systems where these types of creatures may have used as their homes. And there had been battles between the Native Americans and these creatures where they shot them with arrows and trapped them and killed them. And that is talking like, just BC, just before Christ type eras, right? So if you look at this thesis and we look at the fossil record, we can very well prove that these ape-like creatures, these relic hominids, walked the earth the same time as we did. And in Sasquatch Among Wild Men, I'm just trying to prove the thesis that maybe in scarce populations, some of these relic hominids, these ape-like creatures that we have fossil records for, like Gigantopithecus, or maybe even Australopithecus, are walking around in deep wilderness in scarce numbers. And sometimes we come across them and we call it a Bigfoot, or we call it a Sasquatch, or in the case of northeastern Europe, we call it an Almasty or a Yeti. The Russians have called it a Yeti.
Yes.
Our land masses were connected, not too long ago. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, we had the Bering Land Bridge, or the ice bridge, that allowed mammoths to cross from that part of Asia over to North America.
That's right.
And there's all kinds of other things that might have made that crossing too. And when you're looking at something like the Bigfoot or the Sasquatch sightings, we might be looking at a relic hominid that has been well documented in parts of Europe and Asia. You look at the stories of the Yeren. There's hunters that, cryptid hunters that have been following and getting eyewitness accounts of the Yeren in northern China since, even in the past 5 years. So it's not something, again, like the UFO subject, it's not isolated to just North America. It happens everywhere in terms of these cryptid sightings. And I think there's something there. I think not all these people are crazy, and some of them have actually seen what you could describe as a relic hominid still existing.
Darcy, let's shift gears again. And I'm going to ask you to tell us a bit about, basically it's a two-part series. I'm guessing it might not have begun with that as your intention, but you had to keep going for a number of reasons. Beyond the Spectrum and Beyond the Spectrum 2. give our viewers and listeners an idea of what this particular documentary is about.
Yeah, so actually, this documentary you can't get anymore. um, it began as a secret space documentary, which I'm doing this series now with 1091 Films and Uncorked Entertainment, releasing documentaries that are slowly going throughout history, revealing secret space events and UFO encounters in space and so on and so forth. Beyond the Spectrum was really the thesis of that documentary was to talk about, well, yeah, that's humanoids, which you can see humanoids now on Amazon Prime and stuff. Beyond the Spectrum started, the original one that you showed the poster for was supposed to profile that NASA had been using camera technology in space called far light ultraviolet cameras to record phenomenon that was observable not to the naked eye out there in space. So they called this camera the glow camera in the STS space missions. And if you dig deep, you can find information about it, but it's not very widely known. And the glow camera recorded in what looked like a black and white color spectrum, but really it was observing things in ultraviolet, which our human eye can't see. So I created the idea of Beyond the Spectrum because these things that are being seen are being beyond, they're only seen beyond the visible human spectrum, which is from red to purple. If you go beyond purple, you're looking into ultraviolet. If you go beyond red, you're going into infrared. And this is a common place to observe UFOs because some people do declare that they're cloaked or they are intentionally not showing themselves in a light spectrum that we can see, so that probably they can observe and not disturb. But yeah, that was like the impetus of making Beyond the Spectrum. I have reworked some of that material, and one of those documentary posters you showed is just called Humanoids.
Yes.
That is actually a documentary that I wanted to make more in a joking and skeptical perspective. And that was juxtapositioning a hardcore debunkers perspective of possible close encounters of the third kind, aliens here on the planet, with Jaime Maussan's claims of, pictures and videos of aliens that were caught by everyday citizens from around the world. And in most cases, I think a lot of that video of possible aliens is fake. It's, either dolls or possibly CGI. In the case of Skinny Bob, it could very easily be CGI. And a lot of these types of videos, I think the credible cases are like the Brazilian case that James Fox is going to be bringing out soon, Virginha. I don't know how to pronounce that, but this is a case where there's more than just one witness. Military is involved. A whole town of citizens were involved.
Yeah.
Police enforcement was involved, and it has all of the underpinnings of a classic cover-up, combined with the UFO sighting and crash. With a lot of the cases I covered in the Humanoids documentary, it doesn't really happen. And it's usually just like one or maybe max 3 people that saw aliens, and you don't have enough information to pull on. And sometimes it's just footage and the footage is not enough because you have to have multiple credible witnesses in order to, it's like the age old in the court of law. Could you send somebody to jail based on the evidence? And if you can't do that with some of these cases, then it's really hard to argue that they're real.
Yeah. Yeah, no question about it. One of your documentaries regarding UFOs, you titled Volcanic UFO Mysteries. One of the things I also like about your work is I rarely have the sense that you are trying to speak to the elite, speak to those who are deeply involved, those who are kind of initiated into the subject or claim it as their own, as much as to absolutely everybody out there. And, the subtitle here too, it's just so down to earth and so core. What in the world is going on? Giving yourself this kind of project with the latitude that a title like that gives you. For example, the name of the show, Meanwhile Here on Earth. I knew that would give me latitude to cover subjects that did not fall under the heading of the super spooky, paranormal, reincarnated aliens from the center of the earth, etc. So let's talk a bit about this particular DVD documentary. And this is available Amazon Prime and online as well.
Yeah. Volcanic UFO Mysteries was one of those documentaries I actually worked closely with Jaime Maussan again on, because, I had done the biography with him. I had done the crop circle documentary about his research into the crop circle phenomenon since the 90s and onward. And this documentary was really I'd done humanoids. This documentary was really trying to cover that there was some really interesting UFO footage, as well as pictures taken around active volcanic hotspots in Mexico and other places in Latin America. So Colima is the fiery volcano Colima. Really famously, in the documentary, you'll see there's a news crew that was sent out to observe the eruption happening, broad daylight. And during this footage, you see what looks exactly like a saucer type craft slowly moving through the ash, the most dangerous part of an erupting volcano, other than the pyroclastic flows of the lava, right? Yeah. But it's slowly moving through this ash cloud, going around the perimeter of this volcano, and then slowly goes off into the sky around the other side of the volcano. And there was thousands of witnesses to this because, people that are living in the area are curious about the eruption. They want to see that during broad daylight as well. The news crew recorded this footage, and, one might note that no commercial aircraft or military aircraft that we know of can slowly glide through an ash cloud. In fact, during the 2000s, there was that famous eruption in, I think it was Iceland, and the ash cloud spread across all of Northern Europe and parts of Western Europe. And this grounded flights from the UK, France, Germany, like they couldn't fly because of ash in the air. So think about that, in the midst of a UFO going through in very close proximity through an ash cloud that's emanating right from a, cone of a volcano. That's like near impossible. That ash would destroy any one of our types of flights, right?
Again, completely different technology. It has to be.
Yeah. So, I wanted to profile cases like this where we've got an active volcano, we've got pyroclastic lava flows, we've got ash and no plane or no known aerial object that could be part of our military arsenal or commercial arsenals should be able to operate like this in these dangerous areas of the planet. And this was just something I wanted to check out. I had heard Jaime Maussan report about it, and I wanted to go over the footage. So we went from the 1980s all the way to current days. I think we ended in 2020 in that documentary, because that's when I published it. And yeah, it's still happening today. There seem to be UFOs operating in our oceans that are unhindered by the laws of friction caused by the ocean, by actual water. That UFOs seem to create their own physics in any. I mean, Jacques Cousteau said himself, the Earth is really just layers of fluid. The air is a gaseous fluid, and the ocean is a liquid fluid, right? These UFOs seem to operate with impunity in between both fluids, unhindered by normal gravitation and normal, friction and so on and so forth. So, that documentary, I just wanted to profile the strange UFO occurrences around really dangerous volcanoes.
In your evolution as a filmmaker, again, one subject leads to another subject. Right now, as we sit here and talk, are you already at work on what will be your next feature? And if so, can you give us an idea, without telling us things that you'd like to wait until it's out, about it and about how far you've progressed?
Sure. Well, I actually released a documentary on Bitcoin not too long ago this year. So that's my latest doc. But it's called the Bitcoin Field Guide, because we introduced the viewer to cryptocurrency. And that world of cryptocurrency covers things like meme coins, NFTs, smart contracts, Ethereum, Bitcoin, Dogecoin, all these things in between. And we do it in a comedic way as well, to try and make it not boring and more lighthearted, but gives the viewer a crash course in what this whole cryptocurrency world is about. And that was something that was really fun to make. It's it's not cryptids, it's not UFOs. There's something there.
Yeah.
But there's something here too. And I think crypto is going to be here for a long time. It is the evolution of the internet, so to speak. It's where development of applications like what we're using right now, voice and video, as well as development of decentralized finance and gaming, all that stuff is going to continue on blockchain technologies. And it's going to be an interesting world in the future in terms of crypto.
Introducing this subject here, at this early phase, X number of years in to the development of this phenomena, it does tend to polarize people. Some people's eyes just immediately glaze over.
Right.
I know there's stuff here, but oh my God, there's so much I'd have to learn.
It's kind of nerdy. Yeah.
It's exactly so. And I'm an analog kind of person. I like to see my assets, even if it's only paper money. And here I hear this and I hear that about it. First of all, what drew you? You're a person of the world. You're exploring different topics. You interface with different people. What was it that first intrigued you enough about this new chapter world in finance, to the point that you decided that you wanted to do a documentary about it?
Well, I had heard about Bitcoin's run up when it initially went from, a few $1,000s per Bitcoin to $19,000 at the end of 2017. A friend of mine had invested in it, and he was going through the crash of 2018. I was working in IT for a number of years. This is kind of like a 9 to 5 thing that I was doing on the
Sure.
side of, the filmmaking was on the side, because
Pay
to
the
me,
bills.
to me, the filmmaking thing is not a pursuit of endless amounts of money and fame,
Yeah.
like some folks out there. It's actually just a pursuit for truth. It's an interest of mine.
Yes.
And crypto really entered my life through social circumstances. And when I realized that it was going to become an important thing in the future, just like ufology is becoming an important thing in the present and in the future, I decided I need to profile this. I need to make a documentary about it. And I started shooting this in 2018. I interviewed people that are working in this sort of business world that are creating applications and working in the crypto industry. I interviewed people like you and I who are just average consumers, everyday folks that are getting involved in it, crypto miners, traders, and everything in between. And I created a documentary in a field guide way, sort of in a chapter format. So chapter 1 is what is blockchain and what is Bitcoin. Chapter 2 is the history of currency, how we started using money
Yes.
and how that evolved, and how it's very possible that we're going to see the death of many fiat currencies in our lifetime. And fiat currencies, for those that don't know, the US dollar is actually a fiat currency. It means that it's backed by a perceived value agreed upon by governments and bankers. It's not actually backed by anything like gold or oil, although people call the US dollar a petrodollar, and it's a war dollar. But fiat currency only came about after the 1970s because they depegged the US dollar and other baskets of currencies from gold to just being a agreed promissory note. And I think what came out of that change, we're going to see in the upcoming years, we're going to see a further devaluing of the US dollar, the UK British sterling, the Australian dollar, the Canadian dollar. All these fiat currencies are going to go down in value. And the thesis in my documentary is that Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies perhaps are going to be this sort of reset in financial value. And people are going to migrate their hard-earned money and all of their savings and stuff into things like cryptocurrency that are going to hold their value and go up in value in time, more than things like the US dollar, and
What would
possibly
you
other
say,
assets.
Darcy, to somebody who has heard or feels or thinks they know that money kept in this form ultimately will be more susceptible to theft by a new generation of extremely immoral, highly knowledgeable, technologically oriented people, and that they'll be able to literally do the equivalent of tunneling through to the bank vault, removing it over the weekend, and people will find out on Monday that they don't have any more assets. Is this allegorically an issue that you feel needs to be addressed in looking at Bitcoin as a reality?
Well, often the theft of cryptocurrency is two things. It's obviously hackers that have found an exploit in some of these blockchains, and they've used that exploit to siphon money out to themselves or crypto out to themselves.
Hmm.
But, there's always going to be arguments against a new technology, and it is in every single person is a small Luddite voice complaining about the changing of times, but the changing of times is going to come and is going to wash over us, whether we like it or not. And, the invention of the wheel led to greater things. The invention of blockchain technology is going to lead to greater things. You're always going to have robbers. In the Wild West, we had coach robbers, we had
Sure.
train heists, we had bank robbers, and we still have bank robbers today.
You bet.
You could go to some rich person's house with a gun, and if you can get past their security, you just have to aim that gun at that one rich person, and they're probably going to hand over something that's of value. In the crypto space, it's no different. You can still rob people. In terms of Bitcoin itself, that has never been hacked. It's usually people have unknowingly had their mind hacked, which is social engineering, as we call it in IT. It's where you call up somebody and convince them you're working for a bank, but really you're not. You're just convincing them of something so they can hand over something of value to you, whether that's credit card information,
sure, an account
or
number.
an account number. And in this case, a lot of these hacks that have happened are social engineering hacks where clever criminals call up an individual, convince them to hand over, or send them a link. It's as easy as being on a chat forum or on an application and saying, hey, I'm so-and-so from this company. They have a logo. They have a name or something that says administrator. And they say, click this link. Can you, connect your digital wallet? And we're going to fix something with your Bitcoin or with your Ethereum account. We saw that you were having a problem. And they're actually just getting you to click the link. So you link your digital wallet, and then they can steal out of your wallet. They can have the right over your Bitcoin or Ethereum. They can facilitate a transaction to send that to their own wallet. And that obviously is going to be a problem. Banks get hacked all the time. They don't talk about it in the news very often, but they have insurance and fractional reserves to cover these hacks, to replenish the money that's been stolen. But Bitcoin and Ethereum, the actual cryptos themselves, are very seldom actually hacked.
Got it.
It's usually bridges that connect the two, that'll facilitate transactions back and forth. Organizations that are kind of like banks that are holding crypto get hacked. But the actual crypto, the blockchain coins themselves don't get hacked. And people misconstrue that.
As we move in toward the end of the show here, going back over life as a documentary filmmaker, which has taken you to some memorable locations and to interface with memorable people, have you had experiences in exploring the UFO subject, the secret space program, individuals who research Sasquatch, found yourself in a position where you felt you had gotten in too deep?
I feel like I'm getting deeper and deeper as every year passes, to be honest. But no, I think the really interesting thing now is that this is becoming more mainstream.
Yeah.
And I'm very grateful for that. People are yelling at the top of the hills, saying, no, I can't believe Lou Elizondo is a part of this, or I can't believe, these guys that say they're from the military have become a part of this. Now it's all ruined, and it's like COINTEL and, yada, yada. But to me, these guys coming to the forefront, even though they had Tom DeLonge, this like punk rock guy, coming into the mix and creating a show and doing his whole thing. This has done amazing things for the subject, where it's become so accessible. You have Fox News and CNN and all of these major news outlets, instead of posting a spooky story and playing the X-Files music behind it to try and mock the subject, they're actually sitting across credible researchers in ufology,
or
elected officials, and they're having serious conversations about this. So this is a very important time we're living through, where this is more accessible to everyday folks. And I don't think you can get in too deep. I think you can question things and you can worry about the veracity or truth behind them. But really, the onion layers are starting to peel back. And I hope I'm part of that force to bring some of those layers to the mainstream.
A involved outsider who is now aware of your work and has seen a number of documentaries and see how you approach these subjects and how you think, you are involved. You are part of this. You are a very real part of the dialogue, as ufology and the study of truly anomalous, unexplained in any conventional manner, UFO, UAPs, and their implications for humanity as it spills off into the world of documentary filmmakers and filmmaking. You are very much a part of it, no question. The understanding of that we are in a disclosure process, whether or not the United States government likes it or not, there's no putting this toothpaste back in the tube. And that this whole period of time is about people informing other people, or people informing themselves, other people in public debate. I think it's also a very healthy sign in this truly fractious era that we're going through, that besides being taken equally seriously by the media as represented by the left or the right, as the big networks tend to be, that we see among our now more and more ranking political elected officials in Congress and the House a growing interest in taking a public stand on this.
Bipartisan. Bipartisan.
There you go. Whether or not this person is a registered toward the right Republican or a progressive thinking lifelong Democrat, we are finding some common ground here that I think is one of the most important trends as we move forward into more and more unpredictable time in a number of ways, of course. Just off the top of my head, environmental changes, political fractures, natural crises. We have 500,000 people homeless in Pakistan this evening who were not homeless a few days ago. And that's one country at the moment. Or again, the unwinding of officialdom and how the public greets the information coming at us in terms of the disclosure process. Any ideas or thoughts on what we might be seeing coming at us in the next year or so from your perspective as an involved filmmaker?
Sure. I think in this process, you're going to have the same reactions we've had in the past, but just in a larger population representation. So you're going to have the folks that are skeptics of absolutely every single facet of this research, everything they want to debunk, and everything they want to go back to the way it was. Essentially, in my opinion, usually hardcore debunkers don't like change. They don't like the idea that something is out there that is beyond human control.
Bingo.
And so you'll always have those folks on both sides of the aisle. You're going to have scientists, listening to claims from guys like Gary Nolan, and realizing that there's something really real here. And academic institutions are going to have to start taking it very seriously.
Yes.
In the public, there's probably some academic institutions that have been part of the classification of the UFO subject.
Yeah.
And we will see that information come to light, I think, with more disclosure as that happens, as it unfurls, because we do know that there's going to be hearings on the horizon where certain folks and the institutions are going to be releasing more data. That is 3-letter intelligence agencies, research institutions, and academic institutions. I think that's what's going to happen.
Got it. And a question, where can people contact you? Do you have a website? So tell us real quick, and then we're going to have to wrap.
Sure. People can check me out on my website, occultjourneys.com. My social media is there. I have my film posters up, trailers, and yeah, I'm on YouTube, Occult Journeys. I have a show I do with UAMN TV where we talk about fiction films and relate it to real paranormal stuff. So anyways, thanks for having me.
Hey,
take care,
Darcy,
everybody.
My pleasure, and fascinating speaking with you. Next week's guest is another film director brought back on the show because I will be in transit next Monday. Chris Munch is the director of a film titled The 11th Green, about President Eisenhower's alleged contact with non-human intelligences. Peter Robbins is my name. The show is Meanwhile Here on Earth. Stay well, stand up for what you believe in, and be kind to each other.